In the early hours of May 26, 2006, a team of 4 climbing the north ridge of Mount Everest at 8,849 meters pushed human limits at an altitude of 8,500 meters. These altitudes, being significantly higher than sea level, are extremely cold and oxygen-deprived. Known as the death zone, American team leader Daniel Mazur, along with Canadian climber Andrew Brash, British climber Miles Osborne, and Nepalese high-altitude guide Sherpa Jangbu, had been climbing for 8 hours. They were only a few hours away from the summit. The air was still, there was no wind, and the sky was clear. Despite the freezing cold, the team felt strong and healthy. The dream of reaching the highest point on Earth was within their grasp. But just then, as they emerged from a narrow path, the scene before them horrified them all. On the edge of a sharp rocky ridge, just a step away from a 3,000-meter precipice, sat a lone man. Of course, no one had expected such a scene that morning. As I said, they were at an altitude of 8,500 meters, and the sight before them was quite terrifying. At this altitude, it was impossible for anyone to even stop and rest, yet the man in front of the team sat cross-legged, looking as calm as if he were sitting in camp. This mountaineer, named Lincoln Hall, stared into the void with his light brown eyes, his thick climbing suit pulled down to his waist, his arms sticking out of the suit. He wore no hat and no gloves. He wasn't wearing sunglasses or an oxygen mask. In fact, he didn't even have an ice axe, a water bottle, or a food bag. In other words, he had none of the equipment necessary to survive, as far as could be seen. At this altitude, especially if he had spent the night here, it was unthinkable that a person could be alive in such a situation. Mazur and his team initially thought Hall was dead or dying. But when they approached him, the man raised his head and managed to say, "You're surprised to see me here, aren't you?" That was truly a mind-boggling question at that moment. The man in front of them was alive despite this incredible situation and was trying to talk to them. They, of course, found it hard to believe. At an altitude of over 8,000 meters, this man, who was practically half naked, had miraculously survived after a night without oxygen. The person in front of them was Lincoln Hall, an experienced Australian mountaineer, and this was not his first time climbing to such a high altitude. In the past, he had climbed the 7,000-meter Dunagiri and made successful visits to the summits of Annapurna and Makalu. In other words, Lincoln was a well-known and respected man among mountaineers. But his current situation was also clear. The team quickly realized that Lincoln's condition was extremely critical. He was showing signs of cerebral edema caused by high altitude, and his condition was urgent. He was hallucinating, delirious, and when he tried to speak, incoherent sentences came out of his mouth. His body was exhausted and shaking. There were signs of severe frostbite on his fingers and face. He was also severely dehydrated. His lips were cracked, and his consciousness was becoming increasingly clouded. Strangest of all, Hall had no coat to protect him from the cold or gloves to warm his hands. According to the team's initial assessment, the guides had abandoned him during the night when he showed no signs of life, taking his protective clothing and equipment with them. And although Mazur's team was horrified by this sight, there was no time to discuss what to do. They couldn't abandon this man they had encountered here to his fate, as others had done. That morning, Daniel and his team, faced with one of the most difficult decisions of their lives on the path to Everest's summit, were actually no strangers to such extreme conditions. Since the 1990s, he had made numerous ascents in the Himalayas and had managed to reach 9 of the world's highest peaks over time. However, what truly set him apart was not only his achievements in reaching the summits, but his unwavering stance of putting human life above all else. In the mountaineering community, Daniel was known for his selfless attitude, shown without hesitation in life-threatening situations he encountered. Because in the mountaineering community, when faced with such a situation, the person was usually just left behind. Yes, left behind as you know it. And the climb would continue. Because death was seen as inevitable. So much so that in 1991, he sacrificed his own oxygen and time to save a climber on the brink of death on Everest, and in 1992 he saved another climber's life in a similar way. So in each of these incidents, he had given up on reaching the summit. In fact, just a few days earlier, another incident had occurred. Just a few days before the final stages of our team's ascent to the summit, British climber David Sharp had tragically lost his life on Everest. Sharp, like Lincoln, was stranded at high altitude, but unfortunately, he was not as fortunate. Even more tragically, about 40 climbers passed by him that day, but none of them abandoned their summit goals to help him. And in this scenario, Sharp unfortunately froze to death because no one helped him. But unlike David Lincoln, he had fortunately encountered real people, rather than focusing solely on summit attempts. Over the years, while leading many summit attempts, he had repeatedly seen that mountains were not just conquerable targets, but also places where solidarity and humanity were tested. On that ill-fated day in May 2006, the scene that unfolded on Everest's perilous slopes would be perhaps the greatest test of Daniel's accumulated experience and character. After the shock of finding Lincoln Hall alive, Daniel and his team sprang into action. Just a few minutes earlier, their minds had been filled with the excitement of reaching Everest's summit, but now all their attention was focused on saving the life of this exhausted climber. Most climbers could only reach these summits with high-value contracts and sponsorships. But at that moment, no contract or goal could be more important than a human life. The team first set about addressing Hall's critical deficiencies. They immediately took a hat and gloves from their own spare clothing and put them on Hall's head and hands. The first step was to wrap his body, which was half exposed to the cold, again to protect him from freezing. Then they tried to revive him a little by giving him oxygen from their own oxygen tanks. They held their breaths to his lips and made him take a few sips of water, feeding him the small amount of food they had left to help him regain energy. At this altitude, even a simple sip of water was difficult to swallow, and in this situation, Hall's consciousness came and went, sometimes unaware of what he was doing, making the work of those trying to help him difficult. Meanwhile, Daniel was clutching his radio, trying to contact Hall's climbing team. When his call was answered, the first reaction of the other side was disbelief, because Hall's team had assumed he had died the day before and had been forced to leave him on the mountain, announcing his death to the world. On May 25th, he reached the summit of Everest, but suffered a serious illness during the descent. Hall, who began to lose consciousness as a result of altitude sickness, was kept alive for hours by the two Sherpa guides who were with him. At around 8,700 meters, just below the technical passage known as the second step, the Sherpas tried to get Hall to his feet and walk him down. They fought for him for about 10 hours. However, as night fell, Hall was still unable to walk on his own and could barely respond. Meanwhile, the Sherpas' oxygen tanks were running out, and they were beginning to experience snow blindness. The situation was critical. Seeing that Hall was unable to move and had probably lost consciousness, team leader Alexander Abramov made the desperate decision to order the rescue attempt to be called off.
But yeah, look, I don't know what time it is, but I'll talk to you when I can. Okay, thanks. Bye.
And the Sherpas, seeing no signs of life in Hall anymore, had to leave him there after hours of effort. One of them even checked to make sure Hall was truly dead by lifting his eyelid and gently touching his eye to see if he reacted. But there was no movement, no response. Therefore, thinking there was nothing more they could do, they took his backpack and remaining supplies and continued their descent from over 8,000 meters. News of Lincoln's abandonment reaches base camp. Base camp. If he can't move, you can't carry him, because he's started to completely ramble. What can I do? They decide if we don't abandon him, we'll have one dead climber plus 3 dead Sherpas on our hands. When Russian mountaineer Abramov realized there was nothing he could do, he notified the advance camp that night that the climber had died, and even the sad news was relayed to Hall's wife and family in Australia. But now, the next morning, the message transmitted from Daniel Mazur's radio to Hall's team was an incredible miracle precisely for this reason. It said, "Hall is not dead, he is alive. We found him alive. We need help." Mazur had urgently called on the other side to send a rescue team. Although Abramov and the others were initially shocked, upon learning that their friends, who seemed impossible to rescue during the night, were still alive, they immediately sprang into action. When the alarm sounded, Hall's team sprang into action, Sherpas and climbers resting at various points on the mountain, gathered their gear, and prepared to rush to the rescue as soon as they heard the news. At the same time, Abramov was not idle. He had sent a total of 12 Sherpas from his own team and other teams toward the summit to reach Hall. Meanwhile, Myuu and his team were in the midst of a very difficult decision. They were only a few hundred meters away from the summit they had dreamed of for years. Brash and Osborne, who were with him, had spent a considerable amount of money on this climb and spent months preparing for it. For them, the summit was the goal of their lives. But there was a man fighting for his life in front of them. Years of effort and money spent had suddenly lost its meaning. After a brief pause, the three climbers and the guide agreed on the same thing. They would abandon the summit and save Hall. They were 100 meters from the top of Everest, but it was worth the sacrifice. As the sun rose, other teams continued their ascent to the summit, but Myuu and his friends stayed with Hall and began to wait for help. Carrying someone at this altitude was nearly impossible. Hall was drifting in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would mumble, sometimes he would fall completely silent. He was also on the edge of the precipice. His involuntary movements posed a great risk, so they secured him with ropes and safety harnesses. Myuu kept talking to Hall, trying to keep him alive. However, their oxygen was limited, and every minute at this altitude was dangerous. While people usually stay on the summit ridge for no more than 20 minutes, they had been lying motionless there for almost 4 hours. The weather could change suddenly, and the clouds appearing on the horizon signaled the approach of a new storm. If the weather deteriorated, neither Hall nor those waiting for him would survive. Hours later, moving silhouettes finally appeared in the distance. 12 Sherpas climbed rapidly and reached them. They brought hot liquids, oxygen tanks, and medical supplies. They began to stabilize Hall. Myuu and his team were exhausted. Although they were very close to the summit, they could no longer continue. They had only one goal: a safe descent. Hall first had to crawl along the ground. His body was still very weak. However, thanks to the team's determination, after hours of difficult intervention, he was brought down to approximately 7,000 meters to the North Col camp. His brain edema had subsided, but he had permanently lost several fingers. Despite all this, he was still alive. This was a miracle in itself. Myuu and his team were both proud and sad. They had missed the summit, but they had saved a human life. They never regretted this decision. Naturally, the news of Hall's survival spread quickly around the world. The point here, as I said, was not just his survival. It was the rescue of a man who had been presumed dead just yesterday. After spending a night on the summit of Everest, and when the news reached the grieving family waiting for the coffin, the atmosphere of mourning instantly turned into celebration. He wasn't dead. After his days in the hospital, Hall naturally understood the value of life much better. But this would not dampen his curiosity about the peaks. In the future, he would write a book recounting his experience, sharing all the details of what he had gone through in his moments of solitude. Daniel and his team, of course, would be hailed as heroes in the face of this situation. National Geographic magazine would honor him with the title of Hero on Everest, listing him among the adventurers of 2006. And climbing to the actual summit was a different thing altogether. And obviously, even though the team didn't reach the summit that day, I don't know what you think, but I think they were the ones who deserved the summit of the 8,800+ meter Everest the most. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please remember that I do all the work on this channel by myself and can only make these happen with your likes and comments. See you next time. Stay well as always.